There is a particular kind of stubbornness that looks from the outside like a man refusing to move forward. It presents itself at farm sales and equipment dealerships and kitchen table conversations as pride without reason, as sentiment dressed up as practicality, as an old man holding on to something simply because he cannot accept that the world has moved past it. People who see it from the outside rarely understand what they are actually looking at. They see the rust on the hood and the cracked rubber on the steering column and the exhaust stack that has been welded and re-welded until it no longer matches any original dimension. They do not see the 38 years of decisions embedded in that machine. They do not see what it cost to learn to trust something completely. Eldon Schraft had farmed 680 acres in the river bottom country of southwestern Iowa since 1981. He had inherited the land from his father-in-law, a man named August Bremer, who had worked that ground for 40 years before his knees gave out and his eyes went bad enough that he couldn't safely operate equipment alone. August had sold Eldon the farm on a contract for deed over 15 years, terms that were generous by any measure, but that had still required Eldon and his wife Ruth to make decisions about money with a precision that left no room for error across the better part of 2 decades. They had made those decisions carefully. They had come out the other side of them owning the ground outright. That history lived in Eldon, the way formative financial pressure always lives in a person, not as trauma exactly, but as a permanent calibration. A deep and abiding sensitivity to what things actually cost versus what they appear to cost. The Massey Ferguson 590 had come with the farm. August had bought it new in 1977 and run it for 4 years before Eldon arrived. And by the time Eldon took ownership of the operation, the tractor had 4,200 hours on it and a hydraulic top link that August had rigged with a turnbuckle after the original casting cracked, and the dealer wanted more for the repair than August thought was reasonable. Eldon had left the turnbuckle in place for 38 years. He knew exactly why it was there and what it had replaced and what that decision said about the man who had made it. He considered it a kind of instruction. By the spring of the year this story is about, the Massey Ferguson 590 had 21,800 hours on its clock. Eldon had rebuilt the engine twice, once in 1994 and once in 2009. He had replaced the injection pump 3 times, the hydraulic pump twice, and more clutch discs than he could accurately recall. He had welded, fabricated, sourced used parts from 3 different salvage operations in 2 states, and kept meticulous records of every repair in a set of spiral-bound notebooks that lived on a shelf in the machine shed, organized by year. The annual maintenance cost of the Massey, averaged across the previous 8 years, was $2,100. Some years it was less. One year it was $4,800 when the hydraulic pump failed during fall tillage, and he had to source a rebuilt unit from a dealer in Nebraska. But the average was $2,100, and Eldon knew that number the way he knew his corn basis and his property tax rate and the precise depth at which his tile lines ran in every field on the farm. His son Kevin had been pushing him to replace the Massey for 3 years. Kevin was 41, had grown up on the farm, and now managed his own 900-acre operation, 12 miles to the north, that he'd built through a combination of rented ground and a single large equipment purchase. A New Holland T7.270 that he'd financed over 6 years, and that he spoke about with the enthusiasm of someone still in the early stages of a relationship that hasn't yet shown its difficult side. Kevin was not a bad farmer. He was a good farmer who had grown up watching his father operate differently from how he wanted to operate, and the distance between those 2 approaches had become, over years, a conversation that never fully resolved. The argument Kevin made about the Massey was not unreasonable on its surface. The tractor was old. Parts were becoming harder to source. The engine, even freshly rebuilt, burned more fuel per horsepower than anything manufactured in the last 20 years. There was no cab climate control, which meant Eldon worked in summer heat and spring cold in an open station that most operators his age had long since left behind. There was no GPS guidance, no section control, no telematics integration with his planter monitor. The machine was, by any modern technical standard, obsolete. Eldon did not argue with any of those points. He agreed with them individually, each time Kevin raised them. What he did not agree with was the conclusion Kevin drew from them, that obsolete meant replaceable, that the sum of those deficiencies outweighed what he knew the machine would and would not do, and that the risk of financing something new at 67 years old was worth absorbing in exchange for features he was not sure he needed. The spring that changed the shape of the conversation began with an unusual confluence of circumstances among the neighboring farms that Eldon had watched for decades. Mitchell Graff, who farmed 520 acres 2 miles to the east, had purchased a new Kubota M7172 the previous fall on the advice of his dealer and a favorable interest rate promotion. Mitchell was 53, progressive in his equipment decisions, and had spoken well of the Kubota through the winter. In the second week of April, during first pass tillage, the Kubota's electronic draft control module failed in a way that prevented the 3-point hitch from operating reliably. The dealer diagnosed it remotely, identified the part needed, and informed Mitchell that the module was on back order with a lead time of 3 to 4 weeks. Mitchell finished his tillage behind schedule using a neighbor's older machine borrowed at $85 an hour. The Kubota sat in his machine shed for 26 days. Phil Dennison, who rented ground adjacent to Eldon's northern fields and had always been an outspoken advocate for late-model equipment, had traded into a used 2019 John Deere 6155R the previous summer. Phil was proud of the machine and had mentioned it more than once at the grain elevator and at the implement dealer's customer appreciation breakfast in February. In late April, Phil's 6155R threw a fault code during planting that locked the transmission into a diagnostic mode and required a dealer service call. The dealer's earliest availability was 4 days out. Phil lost 4 days of optimal planting conditions in a spring that was already running narrow windows due to wet ground in March. He planted into conditions that were 2 days past ideal on 180 of his acres. He did not talk about the John Deere at the elevator after that with the same energy. Danny Holbrook, who farmed the ground to Eldon's south and had the largest operation in the immediate area at just over 1,400 acres, ran a mixed fleet that included a late-model New Holland T8 series tractor he used for primary tillage. In early May, during a critical window between a rain event and the next system moving through, Danny's T8 developed a DEF system fault that triggered a power derate. The machine would operate at only 30% of rated power until the fault was cleared and the system reset by a dealer technician with the appropriate software access. Danny called his dealer. The technician was 3 hours away and had 2 other farms ahead of him. Danny ran the T8 at reduced power for a day and a half, completing less than half of what he needed to, before the technician arrived and cleared the fault in 20 minutes with a laptop connection. 20 minutes. A day and a half of lost capacity. Eldon saw all of this. He was not the kind of man who said much about his neighbor's difficulties. He had his own, and farming country is small enough that the patience extended to you when your problems are visible is directly related to how you handle other people's. But he noticed. He logged it in the same quiet internal accounting he applied to everything. And by the middle of May, he had a picture of the spring that felt instructive in a way he didn't need to articulate to anyone. His own Massey Ferguson 590 had run every day he needed it to run. The hydraulic system, rebuilt the previous fall with a remanufactured pump he'd sourced through a salvage network he'd cultivated over 20 years, operated without fault. The engine, now 5 years past its second rebuild, ran with the consistency of something that has been through its failures already and come out on the other side of them predictable. When Eldon lifted the hood to check fluid levels in the mornings, he was not reading a screen or interpreting a fault code. He was looking at things he understood with his hands: oil color, coolant level, belt tension, the small details that told him in language he'd learned over decades what the machine was doing and what it needed. Kevin came by in mid-May, which was his habit during planting season. He walked through the fields with Eldon, looked at the emergence, talked about input costs and basis levels and the front that was supposed to come through the following week. Then they went to the machine shed, and Kevin stood looking at the Massey the way he often did, with an expression that mixed affection and frustration in proportions that shifted depending on how his own season was going. Kevin's New Holland had not given him trouble that spring. Kevin's season had gone well. He was in a good enough position to have the conversation generously rather than from any urgent place, and so he raised the replacement question not with the urgency he sometimes brought to it, but with the quieter version, the one that was more about his father's age and comfort than about equipment economics. He said Eldon was 67. He said the open station was not safe in the event of a rollover, regardless of the ROPS bar, in conditions that sometimes got unpredictable. He said sourcing parts for a 46-year-old tractor was only going to get harder. He said there were machines with good financing available right now that would make Eldon's days easier without breaking the operation. Eldon listened to all of it. He sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket near the workbench, the way he sat when he was thinking through something rather than dismissing it, which Kevin recognized. Then Eldon asked Kevin how Mitchell Graff's planting was coming along. Kevin said he thought Mitchell had gotten behind on something mechanical. Eldon nodded and asked how Phil Dennison's corn looked from the road. Kevin said he hadn't looked closely. Eldon said Phil had lost 4 planting days in the best window of the spring. Kevin was quiet for a moment. Eldon didn't say anything more about it. He didn't need to. The summer passed without incident on Eldon's end. The Massey handled cultivation work, some custom hay raking he did for a neighbor, and the secondary tillage passes he ran on his cornfields in July. The machine burned fuel less efficiently than Kevin's New Holland. It lacked the comfort of an enclosed cab through 3 weeks of mid-July heat. These were real costs and real discomforts, and Eldon did not pretend otherwise. But the machine ran. Every day he needed it, it ran. The situation with Danny Holbrook continued through the summer in a way that became something people talked about at the elevator and the coffee shop at the co-op in town. The DEF system fault on his New Holland T8 had been cleared in May, but returned in July under slightly different fault code parameters. The dealer made 2 additional service calls. The second technician, a younger man who had been with the dealership less than 2 years, told Danny off the record that the DEF system on that model year had a known sensitivity issue with certain ambient temperature and load combinations that the manufacturer had not fully resolved in software updates. He said it carefully, the way young technicians learn to say things that are true, but that their employers would prefer communicated differently. Danny heard what was underneath it. Danny was not a man who responded to that kind of information quietly. He had a direct relationship with his dealer principal that predated this machine, and he brought the conversation to that level in a way that involved specificity about hours lost and capacity derated, and the cost of a technician visit at $145 per hour plus mileage against a fault that should not have recurred on a machine of that price point and age. The dealer listened. The dealer agreed the situation was not ideal. The dealer offered a goodwill labor credit on the second service call and submitted an inquiry to New Holland's regional technical representative. The inquiry generated a response that acknowledged the known software sensitivity and indicated a calibration update was in development. Danny asked when the update would be available. The regional rep said the timeline was not confirmed. By September, Danny Holbrook had made it through the summer with the T8 running adequately, but under a cloud of managed uncertainty that cost him something harder to quantify than money. The confidence that the machine would do what he needed it to do in the window he needed it to do it. That confidence, which most farmers consider a baseline rather than a premium, had become something Danny actively monitored rather than assumed. That shift in attention carries its own cost over a season. Eldon ran his Massey through harvest. He used it as a utility tractor during combining, moving grain carts, pulling wagons, handling the support work that happens in the margins of a harvest operation while the combine takes the center stage. Kevin ran a hired combine and used his New Holland for grain cart work on the North Farm. They overlapped operations on a shared field in early October, and Eldon watched Kevin's machine work and noted without saying anything, that the New Holland was a capable tractor doing its job well. He had never argued it wasn't. That was not the argument. The argument, if it had ever been an argument in the formal sense rather than a long, slow negotiation between two men who respected each other, was about something more specific. It was about what Eldon knew versus what he would have to learn. It was about the distance between understanding a machine completely and owning a machine that understands itself through systems you cannot access. It was about what happens when the intelligence in the equipment exceeds the intelligence the operator is permitted to apply to it directly, when the answer to a mechanical question is not in your hands or your experience, but in a service laptop in the back of a truck that may or may not be available when you need it. Eldon was not opposed to technology on principle. He was opposed to dependency he could not manage. There is a difference, and it is a difference that tends to become visible only during the specific moments when a machine stops and the question of what to do next has to be answered in real time with whatever resources are present. In November, after harvest was finished and the fields were worked down for winter, Kevin came by again. He brought with him a printout from a dealer in Ames, a late-model Massey Ferguson 778S, 3 years old, low hours, priced in a range that Kevin said was genuinely reasonable for what it was. He had gone to the trouble of finding a Massey because he understood that brand carried something for his father beyond mechanical familiarity, and that gesture, the effort to meet Eldon in a place that mattered to him, was not lost on Eldon. He looked at the printout for a long time. He asked about the transmission type. Kevin said it was a Dyna 6 power shift. Eldon asked about the electronics architecture. Kevin said he didn't know all the details, but could find out. Eldon nodded. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He put the printout on the workbench and left it there, which was more than he had done with previous suggestions. Kevin drove home, understanding that something had shifted, though not quite what. What had shifted was not Eldon's position on the Massey. It was his understanding of why the position had held as long as it had, and what it would mean to move from it. The spring had given him something, not vindication exactly, because he was not a man who needed other people's problems to justify his own decisions. But it had given him a kind of clarity. He had watched 3 neighboring farmers, all of them experienced, all of them running equipment that was technically superior to his in nearly every measurable way, lose time and capacity and money to systems they did not fully control. He had watched the gap between owning a machine and understanding a machine become visible in the worst possible moments. He had watched the dealership service schedule become a variable that farmers had to manage alongside weather and markets and input costs. And he had run his 590 through another season. He picked the printout up from the workbench in December, during a cold week when the ground was frozen and there was no field work to occupy his hands. He read through it carefully. He noted the horsepower rating, the cab specifications, the warranty terms remaining. He looked at the financing terms Kevin had penciled in the margin. He sat with it. He called Kevin on a Thursday afternoon and said he wanted to look at the machine in person before making any decision, and that he wanted to bring his mechanic, a retired implement technician named Harlan Voss, who had worked on Eldon's equipment for 20 years, and who understood electronic systems well enough to evaluate what he was looking at. Kevin said that was entirely reasonable. They went to look at the tractor on a Saturday in mid-December. Harlan spent an hour going over it, while Eldon walked around the outside, and Kevin talked to the salesman about availability and transport. Harlan pulled up the fault history on the dealer's diagnostic system and found 2 historical codes, both cleared, both minor, that he discussed with Eldon quietly in the corner of the service bay. He said the machine looked sound. He said the Dyna 6 transmission was a known quantity, that he'd worked on them enough to be comfortable with what he was seeing. He said the electronics were more complex than the 590, but that the architecture was accessible enough for someone with his background to diagnose outside the dealer network in most situations. Eldon asked about most. Harlan said there were some system-level resets that required dealer software, same as most things built in the last decade, but that the percentage of failures that fell into that category was lower on this platform than on some others he'd seen. Eldon thanked him. They drove home. He didn't make a decision that day. He made it 3 weeks later, after he'd thought through every angle he could think of and run the numbers against his maintenance records and his current loan position and his projected cash flow for the coming season. He called Kevin on a Monday morning in early January and told him he'd like to proceed with the 778S if it was still available, and that he wanted Harlan present during delivery setup to understand the diagnostic access protocols before the machine ever went to the field. Kevin was quiet for a moment on the phone, the quiet of someone absorbing news they have been hoping for without being certain they would receive it. Then he said that was exactly right and that he'd set it all up. The Massey Ferguson 590 did not go to auction. Eldon sold it privately to a man named Carl Pruitt, who had a small cow-calf operation 20 miles away and needed a utility tractor for bale moving and light tillage, and who had specifically sought out an older machine he could work on himself. Carl had driven over to look at it, walked around it in the same careful way that people who understand machinery walk around machinery, started it and listened to it run and checked the hydraulics and looked at the maintenance records Eldon laid out on the workbench. Carl had offered a fair number, and Eldon had taken it without negotiating because the number was fair and because he wanted the machine to go somewhere it would be understood. When Carl drove the 590 out of the yard on the trailer, Eldon watched from the machine shed door until the trailer cleared the section road and disappeared behind the timber. Ruth came out and stood beside him. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. After a while, he went inside. The new Massey arrived the following week. Harlan came for the delivery and spent 3 hours with the dealer technician, going through the diagnostic systems, the software access protocols, the fault code architecture. He took notes. Eldon watched and asked questions at specific points. By the time the dealer truck left, both of them had a working understanding of what the machine required and what they could handle themselves and what would need dealer involvement and under what circumstances. Kevin came by that evening. He walked around the new tractor in the shed, looked at the cab, ran his hand along the hood. He said it looked right. Eldon agreed it looked right. Kevin started to say something and then didn't. Eldon said he knew. Kevin nodded. What Kevin had started to say, and what Eldon had preempted because he'd been thinking about it for weeks, was something about having been right. About the years of suggesting the 590 had run its course, and the fact that his father had finally come to the same conclusion. But Kevin was smart enough to understand that saying that would misread what had actually happened. Eldon had not come to Kevin's conclusion. He had come to his own conclusion, on his own timeline, through his own evaluation of what he knew and what the spring had shown him and what Harlan had told him in the corner of that service bay. Those were different things. The outcome looked similar from the outside. It was not similar from the inside. The 590's spot in the shed was empty for 2 weeks before the new machine arrived. In those 2 weeks, Eldon had noticed the empty space every time he went out to the shed, which was several times a day out of habit. He didn't dwell on it. It was just there, the negative space where something had been for a long time, and the particular quality of its absence before something else takes the place. That is the way of decisions made carefully after years of holding a position. They do not feel like surrender, and they do not feel like triumph. They feel like the resolution of a long and complicated negotiation with reality. The moment when a man who has paid attention to everything finally decides that the weight of what he knows has shifted enough to justify moving. The fields outside that river-bottom country were frozen in January. Spring was 4 months away. Eldon had a new tractor and a mechanic who understood it, and a son who had the good sense not to say anything that would make the moment smaller than it was. He went to the shed that first evening and started the 778S and let it run for 20 minutes in the cold, listening to it. The engine sound was different from the 590. The cab was warmer than any cab he'd ever sat in. The display screen glowed with information he had not yet learned to read the way he needed to read it. He would learn. He had 38 years of learning how to understand machines, and he had Harlan, and he had the notebooks on the shelf that told the story of everything he'd kept running through patience and attention, and the refusal to spend money before he understood exactly what he was spending it on. The old stubbornness, seen from the outside, had looked like a man refusing to move forward. Seen from the inside, it had always been something else. It had been a man making sure that when he moved for the right reasons, with the right information, on his own terms. That is not stubbornness. That is the way some men survive.